Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We've got a really exciting webinar lined up for you. We're going to talk all about Nextflow. So purely on open source, talking about Nextflow with the new VS Code extension that we've released recently, and also all of the associated changes which come along with that. So I'm really excited to see what everyone thinks of these changes and also hear from you about what you want to see from this and what your thoughts are. So just a few introduction slides for me. My name is Phil Ewels, and I'm a senior product manager at Sekera, working with the open source tools. And joining us and really doing all the hard work today is Ben Sherman, who's the senior software engineer at Sekera, working in the Nextflow team, long-time developer for the Nextflow code. So I'm gonna be handing over here to him just in a minute. And before I do that, a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, we've got the chat open with everyone saying hello. Feel free to use the chat for chatting, but if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box instead. We're going to have a chat discussion at the end of the webinar, and we'll be taking all the questions only from the Q&A. So please pop them in there to make sure you get an answer. The polls, you've seen one poll already, a fun one. There'll be a couple more right at the end, so keep an eye out for those. Make this as interactive as possible. And also this whole webinar is being recorded, and we will share that link with everybody who signed up to the webinar in a couple of days. So don't worry if there's anything you missed. That will be shared with you later. Just an overview then of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start off with a very brief overview of Sekera, the company, how we fit into this picture around Nextflow and what it is that we do on a very broad level. And then I'll hand over to Ben, and Ben will talk all about the VS Code extension and language server for Nextflow, and then go into some detail about some of the new Nextflow syntax updates which are coming out in Nextflow. And then at the end, we've got some live Q&A. We normally spend less time on Q&A, but we figured that this was a really good opportunity to have some good back and forth with people in the community. So we've made that as long as possible. So please throw lots of questions into the Q&A, get us chatting. Really excited to see what you think of it, and let's make this as interactive a webinar as possible. Okay, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes as a general introduction to Sekera. So hopefully everyone joining this webinar knows what Nextflow is. It's the workflow manager created by Paolo and Evan and others at the CRG in Barcelona, first released around 2013, open source piece of software. Nextflow really took off in bioinformatics, and one of the things that the Nextflow team started having meetings around 2017 in Barcelona. And soon after that very first meeting, I co-founded the NF Core community along with Alex Peltzer and others working with Nextflow. And that really was an independent from Sekera, but really kind of built up this really strong community around collaborating and building Nextflow pipelines. Nextflow went from strength to strength. And in 2018, Sekera was founded by Paolo and Evan to really kind of handle the need for large scale support and also development around Nextflow. Fast forward to today, and Sekera is got over 100 employees, and Nextflow itself is used by tens of thousands of or hundreds of thousands of scientists all around the world. What Sekera itself offers then is all the everything that goes around Nextflow. Running Nextflow by itself is a really important part of the puzzle, but you also need to create infrastructure, handle data inputs and outputs, work with different levels of permissions, organizational settings, authentication of secrets, upstream and downstream processes around Nextflow. And so what Sekera offers in the form of Sekera Platform is kind of everything around this. It fulfills out the whole ecosystem around managing Nextflow. Sekera now has many of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies in the world as customers, and really kind of going from strength to strength. The mission of Sekera is to advance science for everyone through software, so applying kind of software best practices to the application of scientific research. And we focus our efforts across three kind of steps. We're still very, very focused on open source software, and that's kind of the bottom of the stack for us. We spend a lot of time and resources building and maintaining open source software such as Nextflow, Also multi-QC, and our other major open source offering is Wave for building and managing containers on the fly. And all of those tools are always open source and always can be used standalone. On top of that, we're really enthusiastic about helping discovery. So we've recently launched this year a community service to host and build containers, open source containers for anybody, and also listing of pipelines. And then at scale, we provide Secure Platform and Fusion, which helps to run pipelines more effectively, more cheaply at scale, with other services such as Data Studios and Data Explorer for things downstream analysis. Okay, that's enough from me. Hopefully I've piqued your interest about Secure. But now I'm going to pass it over to Ben here. He's going to take us through this webinar and talk to us all about Nextflow VS Code. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome everybody. I'm coming at you today from Texas in the United States, and I'm just pulling up my screen so that everybody can see. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now. I've got VS Code open. Just as a little bit of background, so I've been Sherman, and I work on the Nextflow team. I've been working on Nextflow for about 3 years now, and this past year, I've been working on a new project, which is what we're showing today, the Nextflow language server and the new VS Code extension. Nextflow's had a VS Code extension for a long time, but it only contained, some basic syntax highlighting. So now with the latest version 1 release of the Nextflow VS Code extension, it is now supercharged with a language server. If you don't know what a language server is, chances are you've interacted with them either way. It's basically sort of a background service that you can add on to your editor, like VS Code supports this idea. And typically, each programming language out there will implement their own language server. So, you can go out there and find a Python language server, Java language server, JavaScript, TypeScript, whatever. All the major languages have one at this point. And basically, they allow you to have all of the nice code intelligence features that you're probably used to at this point. Things like inline error highlighting, code navigation, hover hints, all that good stuff. And so Nextflow has gone without that for a very long time. And we've finally been able to implement that and deliver that for you guys. And along with that, we have developed basically a formal language specification for Nextflow, because Nextflow up to this point has been just basically a Groovy DSL, which basically means you can write any Groovy code, and then there's a little bit of extra syntax for Nextflow specific things. But now that Nextflow is becoming more of an industry standard, we're trying to move Nextflow towards being a proper language, something that has a proper language definition, where we spell out all the things that you can do in the language and things that you can't. And we'll get into that later on in the demo. But for now, what I want to start out with is just to show you what it looks like to use the language server in VS Code. So I've got VS Code open, and I've got the NF core fetch and GS pipeline already pulled down, specifically using the dev branch. So if you guys want, you'll be able to follow along with everything I'm doing. All you have to do is get VS Code and pull down NF core fetch and GS. If you're not familiar, fetch and GS is one of the simpler NF core pipelines. Basically, the purpose of it is you give it a list of SRA IDs, and then it downloads all of the FASTQ samples associated with those IDs into whatever location you want. And it's typically used as the precursor to other pipelines like RNA-seq or SAREC or differential abundance, whatever you might want. And so I figured this would be a good example to showcase the language server. Now, the first thing that you want to do before you install is to check your Java version. So you can go in your terminal here, and you can do Java-version. And you just want to make sure that you have Java 17. I call this out because Nextflow up to this point has supported Java 11 or later, so you may only have Java 11. The latest edge release of Nextflow has upgraded to Java 17 or newer, so you will have to start using Java 17 anyway, but I would just go ahead and make sure you have it installed. If you don't have it installed, you can go to the Nextflow docs to the installation page, and those instructions already use Java 17 in any case. Now, I want to make sure that okay, yeah, there's my keystrokes so you can follow along. So once you've installed Java, you can go into the Nextflow, go to your extensions, and you can look up Nextflow. And it should be the first one that comes up, and you should see the current version is 1.0.2. And so this is the newest version with the language server. You can see in the README here all of the new features that we preview, or at least we have at least one example here. There's more examples in the docs. So we'll install that. Then if we go back into our files, I'm just going to open up the main script. Now, once you open a Nextflow script, you'll see a thing down here saying, initializing workspace. So once you open a Nextflow script, it's going to look at it's basically going to scan this entire workspace, this entire directory tree for any Nextflow scripts as well as config files, and load them all into basically an internal model so that it can keep track of all of your code changes. So what's happened now is that it's loaded everything. It's now got all of the Nextflow code in this repository loaded into, basically loaded into memory, and it has a sort of understanding of everything that exists in this code. So when you hover over things, you'll be able to see hover hints for various things. Like when I hover over a process or a workflow, it will give me this sort of a summary hover hint of that workflow definition. So in this case, we're looking at the pipeline initialization workflow, and it's just showing us the inputs and outputs, basically, so that you can get a quick overview of what it is. Similarly, with things like variables, you can get hover hints. And then also, any errors that you would normally get when you run your pipeline, they're just going to show up in line. The easiest way to do that is if I do Control-Shift-M, that can pull up this problems tab. Another way is if we bring this back down, you can also just drag this up and it will bring it up. And then you just look for the problems tab here. So you'll see now it's showing us errors and warnings across all of our Nextflow scripts and config files. Now, depending on your code and how depending on how much you adhere to sort of the recommended style in the Nextflow docs versus how much maybe you do a lot more crazy sort of groovy stuff, you may see more or less errors here. The reason is because the language server enforces a syntax that is a bit more strict than what Nextflow allows. And so for the time being, it may seem that the language server is being overly strict, that it's pointing out things that are errors that aren't actually errors when you run Nextflow. The thing that I want to make clear here is that we're in sort of a transition period. So right now, the language server is sort of enforcing a future version of the Nextflow language. And over time, these more strict rules are going to be incorporated into Nextflow itself. So I wouldn't panic. You still have a good while to update your code, but just keep in mind that future releases of Nextflow are going to gradually start incorporating this new stricter syntax. At first, it'll be opt-in, so you'll still have, the current, parsers available. Over time, it'll become the default, and then eventually it will become the only way to write Nextflow code, and the old ways will be removed. So consider the language server as sort of a very strict linter for the time being. And I would just advise you guys to basically try to fix the errors, especially as soon as you can. The warnings are not as important because warnings are not going to fail your pipeline code. They're more of just a nice thing to do, just general guidance, best practices, things of that sort. But you don't have to worry about the warnings as much. So one thing we'll go and look at here is, for example, here's an example where it's highlighting an error. it's saying that this class is not defined. This is really something that we'll probably just fix in the NF core pipeline template. So I'm not going to harp on this particular error too much because we'll probably just fix it in the template and then you won't have to worry about it. But in general, you can see it's highlighting the error. And then when you fix it, then the error goes away, pretty straightforward. You can also see, probably the most useful thing this will help you catch is things like typos. So if I, define this variable here, and then down, well, actually, maybe this one isn't being used. Let me try this a different way. Here's a variable that we're referencing. And so now, let's say we have a typo here. It's going to say, okay, this variable is not defined. We can also, you can see here, and it may be, in certain cases, it will also, okay, yeah, so you can also see here that this parameter, it's detected that this parameter is coming in, but you didn't use it anywhere. So this can be a nice little check, if the names don't match up. So once you've addressed those errors, in some cases, there are different kind of errors. Like there's also, you can imagine things like, you have a stray comma or a missing comma somewhere like that. It'll also catch errors like that. Some errors will, depending on the kind of error, that may prevent the code from being able to sort of give you all the nice code intelligence, like the hover hints. So, for example, let's say we go in here and let's just add a syntax error in here. I haven't had to create an example like this. It used to be that Fetch and GS just had these errors in here, and now we fixed all of them, so they're not showing up. So nice problem to have. But you'll see here, so we have this sub workflow, and I've added a comma here, so we've created this syntax error. And now over here, we're getting an error when we try to import the workflows into this pipeline. And so, and if we hover over, we'll see module could not be parsed, and then it's giving us this file. What's happening here is that because of this syntax error, this file was not able to be parsed at all. So Nextflow wasn't able to pick up on all of these different definitions. And so for that reason, when you're trying to import these definitions over here, it doesn't actually know that these definitions exist. It knows that this file exists because you can click on this file and open it up, right? But it doesn't know which workflows exist. So whenever you encounter errors like this, all you have to do is you can control click on the file and then just look for any syntax errors in here. Now, they may be a little difficult to point out. I mean, we can highlight it here. There's an extension called Error Lens, which you can use. In fact, why don't we just install it right here, right now? And then you'll be able to see what it does. Looks like I had it disabled. And this is just a completely different extension, but a lot of people like to have it installed alongside. So this will actually just put the error in line next to the error itself. So maybe that makes it a little easier to stand out. But you can find it that way, or again, you can go into the Problems tab. You can click on a file. You can go into here and say Show Active File, and that's just the easy way to filter out just the errors in this file. There we go. So we'll fix that error. And then we see back over here, okay, now it recognizes the workflows. All right. Another thing I want to show while we're in the main script here is, as you guys may be familiar, NF Core has this JSON schema for defining pipeline parameters, right? And so the language server has a basic sort of integration with this. So if you use this standard parameter schema, the language server, and basically, if as long as you have it alongside your main script here, the language server will pick it up and try to use it specifically in the entry workflow. So this only works in the anonymous workflow here. if you see if I hover over a param, it's going to give me the information from the JSON schema. So it's giving me the description and the type. And also, if I make a typo, then again, it can call out and say, hey, this parameter wasn't defined in the parameter schema, right? And then also you can do params and then dot, and that will trigger the auto completion. And so now you can see it's giving me a list of all the different parameters that are available with a little bit of, again, it's the same information from the hover hint. So we'll just search up ENA, and then we're back to where we started. Okay. And then similarly, just in general with code completion, the code completion, I would say it's never going to be perfect, but it tries to give you, whenever you're typing, it tries to give you as many options as you can. It can also, so in this case, it can also make suggestions for processes and workflows that are not imported. So in this case, we haven't imported this process into this main script. And so if I select this, then it's actually going to auto import it up here. And then similar things like you have access to operators, built-in variables. Maybe let me scroll up a bit so we can see that better. So things like the workflow metadata, right? And then all those options in there. We try to provide, as much code completion here as we can with the documentation. And alongside that, whenever you hover over that information, you should be able to see all of that going on here. Here's an example with a channel factory. So we can just do, let's do channel.of. And the code completion, okay, it looks like it is working with the dot. The code completion is a little bit spotty here, so just bear with us if it doesn't quite work. We're constantly trying to improve this. But then you can see when I hover over this operator, for instance, in many cases, whenever there's relevant documentation, it'll give you a little read more link. And so if I click on read more, it's going to open that up in a browser window, and it opened it up off screen. So I'm just going to drag it over here so you can see what it did, right? And so most of the time, hopefully the hover hint gives you, a good enough idea of what's going on. And then if you need more context, you can pull up the docs immediately and it'll take you right to it. So you don't have to be searching the docs all the time. Okay, let's look at code navigation for a moment, because what I found, even as I've worked on this language server, is that really one of the most annoying things about working with code is whenever you have to, navigate through the directory tree over here to look up files. You really shouldn't have to do that. Now, you can also do Control P in VS Code, and you can search up files this way. And I can even do things like this. Let's say Aspera, and it'll also search through the directories here. But an even quicker way now is, let's say I'm looking at this workflow, and I want to just, well, you can just Control click, and it looks like in this case it pulled up a preview. That's actually something new. I thought it was going to open up the file as a separate file, but in this case it opened up a preview. Let me try that again. Okay, it looks like maybe if you see, I'm learning as much about VS Code as you guys here. It looks like if you hold down Control for a long time and then click on it. Oh, okay. Well, I have no idea why it pulled up the peak there. You Control click on it, the same way as clicking on these include links here. It will just open up the file for you and take you right to that definition. Another way you can do it is, let's close this out again. If we go to definition, that's basically doing the same thing. And then that little preview that you saw, the normal way to get that is if you do peak definition, then you will see it just pulls up the code, and this is called a code lens in VS Code. So it just allows you to look at the code very quickly without opening up a new file. And then also we can do peak references, and this is just going to pull up. So it's a similar thing, but now it's showing all the places where this workflow is referenced, including where it's defined, where it's called, where it's imported. Also, even let's look at this one, for instance, because I think this one has a case where, well, maybe not. Okay, let's go down here and look at this one. It will also show you places where you're referencing outputs. So if we do something like, workflow.out or process.out, it will show those as well. So again, just a quick way to see all the places where a pipeline is used across files, right? Because it's showing me where it's defined over in this file, and then also where it's used in this other file. And then there's one last way to do code navigation, which was just made possible in 1.0.2. You'll see once you've fixed all the errors in your pipeline, well, you'll see this preview DAG button appear over the workflow. And so we can click on that, and it will basically generate a mermaid diagram of the workflow, very similar to the one that you can get from Nextflow, from the preview DAG. The main difference is that it's just showing the one sub workflow here, and it's only showing inputs, outputs, processes, and workflows. So you're not going to see any of the extra channels or operators, because those typically aren't what people are interested in. You mainly want to see what is the data flow between the different processes and modules. You can also see here, in this case, it's not expanding out this sub workflow. It's just showing this sub work. It's not showing all of like the processes within. If you want to go and sort of zoom in, what you can do is just click on this sub workflow, and it does the same thing as the go-to definition. It'll pull up that workflow or the file for it. And then what we can do is just preview the DAG for this one, okay? And so now we've got, and this is sort of the core workflow of Fetch and GS. I'm just gonna drag it over here to make it full screen. So now you can see a little bit more of the guts, right? We've got the IDs coming in, and then we've got the outputs over here, and then we've got all of the different processes and sub workflows, and we can just keep clicking and making our way down. Let's drag this back over here for now. And so now we've pulled up this sub workflow, and again, we can just keep going and pull up all the way down to a process. So a very powerful way to just sort of have your code and the diagram side by side, navigating. It doesn't do like a live update. So say if I go back here and I, let's just open this up again. If I like start changing stuff or deleting stuff or whatever, you're not going to see it live update. So you would just need to just click the button again, and it'll pull up the view again. Okay, I think there's one more thing I want to show with just the VS Code is maybe just looking at a process, because the process, processes in Next will have a lot of information in them, right? You've got inputs, outputs, directives. So basically just wanted to show, again, with the directives, you've got this same documentation, hover hints, read more link, different types of inputs and outputs. Again, you can see all of the relevant information. Let me see if there was anything else that I wanted to mention here. Yeah, I think that's good for now. And so how are we doing on time? Okay, we're about halfway through. So now what I'd like to do, and Phil, are there any pressing questions that you think we should address at this point? Or do you have it taken care of? I'm just going to take that as a thumbs up from him. So we're going to keep going.
Sorry, I had myself muted. I've been handling questions. We've got a few good ones at the end there. One thing I don't think you mentioned is about formatting code.
Oh, yes. So let's get rid of some of these things here. So yeah, Nextflow also comes with an auto formatter now. this one is also a bit of it's very close. I wouldn't say it's quite perfect yet. So I would not recommend using it sort of like in an automated way. VS Code has a feature where you can sort of format on save. You might find that annoying right now if you do that. But what you can do is you can go into the command palette. The command is called format document, or you can also do Alt-Shift-F, and that will basically format your code. And we can see what changes it did here. Let me just remove those. So it looks like in this case, not a lot of changes, a couple of white space changes, and then it just moved, it reordered the workflows, basically. It moved the entry workflow to the top. So this is something you can do just to have consistent white space if you want. Like, for example, if I add a bunch of extra tabs here, or extra spaces, and then I format again, you should see, okay, it fixed the indentation, things of that sort. So that's an easy way you can do if you want. If you encounter oddities with the formatting, please don't hesitate to, ping us on Slack or make an issue on GitHub, because there are, there's just a lot of little edge cases that we're constantly trying to iron out, right? So we're constantly trying to improve that. Anything else, Phil?
I think that's good for now. We've got some more questions at the end, but we'll come back to them.
All right, sounds good. In that case, I'm going to switch now to a different branch. This is actually a PR that I have. Let me see if I can pull it up this way. So the PR is called DSL2 Plus. I'm just going to check this out. So we're going to switch the branch. The branch is called DSL2 Plus. And I just wanted to point this out because this PR contains a lot of changes that sort of, because we're using Fetch.js as a sort of a guinea pig for a lot of our syntax improvements. And so this PR contains a lot of changes that are representative of what we'd like to do in the future. And we call it DSL2 Plus because it is still DSL2, although we aren't really planning to have like a DSL3. The better way to think of it is that we're going to have the Nextflow language, and we'll basically have, just iterations of the Nextflow language. We'll continue to evolve it over time. I'm not quite sure what the nomenclature is going to be, if there will be any. But all this is to say, all the changes that you'll see in this PR, and Phil, if you could maybe copy the link to this PR into the chat, that might be good so that people can follow along. We can see it here. All of the changes in this PR should be possible now in Nextflow 24.10. So I just wanted to go through some of them and highlight what's going on. Some of these are related to the more strict syntax that I was talking about. We'll get into more detail about that, I think, in a moment. Most of the things in this PR are actually just sort of new features and functionality that hopefully will just help you have, cleaner, more readable code. So they're sort of separate from the strict syntax ideas. Hopefully we can parse that out here. The first thing I'll point out is we'll just open one of these processes. So here's that Asperis CLI process again. And what you'll notice here is that we've changed a bit of the logic around these tool versions. So in case you don't know, all the NF core pipelines have this sort of convention where they save the versions of the command line tools in the task script, and then they save it all to a YAML file, and then they emit those YAML files as an output. And then there's a bunch of logic all throughout the pipeline to collect all of these little YAML files and concatenate them into one big YAML file, and then just save that out as a report at the end so that we can capture the exact versions of the tools that were used. And so we added a few features over the past year or so to try and streamline this process as much as possible, because we recognize that it is an important need to track all the tool versions, and there's not an easy way to get those versions outside of just when you actually run it in the script. And so what you'll see here is that we've added this there's actually two new features going on here. One is the eval output. Let's spread this out a little bit. So you'll see here, we've got this eval output. And basically what this does is you give it a bash command, and then it will execute that bash command in the task scripts. It'll sort of inject it into your script. And then it'll save the whatever like the text output of that command, it will save that here. So kind of like a val, because this ASCII version is just going to return a string, and then we just include that string in this tuple. And so we have a tuple here that includes the process name, and then just noting that this is for the Aspera CLI command. And then the second thing is instead of giving it an emit name, we're actually giving it a topic. And so what we're saying here is send this value to a topic channel called versions. Now, a topic channel, you can think of it as sort of a global channel that any process can write to using this syntax. Any process can have an output that writes to this topic channel. And the topic channel is sort of like a giant mix operator. It takes all of those values coming in from all the processes, and it collects them all into a single, like a queue channel. And then you can use that channel like any other queue channel. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Now you can also have an emit on this output. I would say as a best practice, maybe just do one or the other, only because the intention of this topic channel is to just sort of collect metadata across the entire pipeline. Of course, you guys are welcome to try and use topic channels in other creative ways. We've actually found some interesting other ways to use topic channels that we'll be writing about in the future. But in general, it's best used as sort of a global thing for collecting global metadata. And I'll show you how we actually like reference that topic channel in a moment. But one more thing I'll point out here is just that you'll see all of this extra boilerplate where we're writing the YAML file and saving all this information. Now we can delete that because Nextflow will do that automatically because of the eval output that we declared here. And also as a nice bonus, in this case, this process actually has two different scripts that it can use. So they were duplicating this code, and now you can delete it in both cases. Let's go down a bit to, let's look at the workflow where this was being used. So we'll pull up the SRA workflow. Actually, let's use the language server to help us here. So let's see where this workflow is being, or where this process is being called. So we'll do peak references, and we'll see, okay, it's being included into this file. So let's just open that up. I think we can just click on it. Yeah. And then I'll click on this icon up here just to pull up the PR diff. So I probably should have actually just pulled up where it's actually called. So you can see here's where it's being called. And actually this workflow probably isn't even as good. Okay, so this workflow has some other changes. I'm going to save this for a moment and just pull up a different sub workflow where you can see this more cleanly. So here's just another sub workflow. You can see it calls a couple different processes here. And you can see the diff here is that this is what I was talking about earlier. Previously, you had to have this versions channel, and you had to like basically after every single process call, you would have to append those process versions to this channel. So you have all this boilerplate going on here. So now we can just delete all of that because this is going to happen automatically because of how the topic channel works. And maybe I should just go ahead and show you how that topic channel works on the back end. If we go back to the main workflow here, I believe this is where I'm using it. Okay, it's hidden behind this function. So now I just have this function for collecting all of these tool versions. You can see they were already here, but defined a slightly different way. So what we're doing here now is we're saying channel.topic. So this is like a new channel factory method. And then we just give it that name of the topic that we want. So we want the versions topic. And then we're just doing all the same logic that was already in this pipeline. We're just collecting all the data, and then eventually it's going to get written into a YAML file. So all of that logic with the versions channel is being replaced by this one thing. On the one hand, in the process output, you use that topic option, and then when you're ready to collect everything, then somewhere in your workflow you can call channel.topic, and then you get all of those items. And then this is just a queue channel, so all the same operators are available. These are just the regular operators, right? The difference is that this queue channel is sort of just defined in a slightly more magical way. So I think this sort of new syntax is being rolled out in the NF core modules, and it'll be available at some point in the future. And then you'll be able to just start using them in the modules quite easily. I think that's the main thing I wanted to show in this sub workflow. Well, let's go back to the SRA, the core workflow here. So there's a couple different things going on here that we want to point out. First thing I want to point out is that notice that we've got a few more inputs coming in here. What was happening before was that we were because these are all params, basically. What was happening before is that we were just referencing the params object directly. You can see us doing that here. The pattern that we'd like to move to is only referencing this params object in the entry workflow. That's the main workflow here. So ideally, you've got your entry workflow here. You should reference the params, and then you should just pass the individual params into sub workflows as they need it. Now, this is not something that we're enforcing anytime soon. If you turn on the deprecation warnings in the language server, then you might see some warnings around this. But again, I would say not to panic about this, but just consider trying to move towards this pattern as best you can. Even in this PR, I haven't moved towards this perfectly. You can see I'm still using them here, only because it is kind of a pain to pass them through a bunch of different nested sub workflows. So I think there's some other language improvements that we like to add to make this a bit easier to do. But I'm just pointing this out here that, I'm in this PR, I'm moving towards this as best as I can without causing too much of an inconvenience. So these are just params coming in from the entry workflow as regular inputs. I suppose it's worth pointing out, because maybe this is a common misconception, that these inputs don't have to be channels, right? They can just be regular values, and the workflow will just pass them in as a regular value. So workflow inputs can be anything, just like function arguments or process inputs. And then again, you can see the versions channel boilerplate. We're removing that. And then down here, we've done a little bit of refactoring of some of the output channels. So this gets into the last improvement that I want to talk about here. And actually, we are right at 45. So I'm just going to try to mention this quickly, and then maybe we can get into some questions. What this is doing is we're introducing a new syntax for defining workflow outputs. I'm talking about basically the things that are published by the pipeline, the output files. Normally, you would have to do this through the publish dir directive, and it was done, at the process level. And we're trying to move this more into the workflow level. So instead of you telling the process, hey, publish these files out of this specific task, instead, no, just you should have channels in your workflow that sort of represent the data that you're working with, not just the files, but typically, like if you're working with samples, right? Those samples are going to consist of files and some metadata, right? So we want a better way to really preserve all of that metadata alongside the files. And so what we're doing here is we've removed all of the publish dir definitions. If we go in here, in this case, they're all being defined in the config. So we've removed all of these publish dir directives. And instead, we structured it so that we have this samples channel, which includes all of the sort of, the same structure as the sample as you could imagine, right? You've got the sample metadata here, and then the FASTQ files, and then the MD5 checksums. We're just going to have a channel for that. We're going to emit it as an output. Fetch.gs normally generates a sample sheet, like the CSV file with all of this information manually. That's what all these processes were for. We've removed that entirely because we're going to do that with the new output definition. So now if we go back to the main workflow, keep in mind we have this samples output. And then we're propagating it back up. And then in the entry workflow, we're going to publish this channel. So this is a new section in the workflow body. You can use it in any workflow, but best practice, I would say, is try to use it in the top level workflow. Again, it can be a little bit more inconvenient with passing things up and down the call stack, but if you can do this, then this is a nice way to have all of your pipeline outputs listed here, all in one place. And so we're publishing the samples channel to the samples topic. And then down here, we have a new block called the output block. And then we're defining this samples. So I said samples topic. This is actually a target. So this is basically a workflow output called samples. And there's two main things you can put in here. There's some other options, but we'll just focus on this. The first one is the index file, which is essentially just going to take those channel values that you published and write them into a CSV file or a JSON file that's going to include all of the published file paths as well as any of the metadata that was in the channel. So best practice, I would say, is to, when you get ready to publish a channel, just create a map that includes all of the metadata keys as well as the keys for the files that you want to publish. And then Nextflow will basically scan this map. It will find any of the files that you have in here, and then it will publish those files. And then the other thing we're doing here is this path directive, which is just a way for us to map the files that we want to publish to their destination path. This is very similar to the save as option in published here. This closure here is essentially that. I'm not going to get into this in much more detail because this is a bit of a complex topic and probably warrants maybe a blog post or other things. We can get into it if you guys have questions. But those are the main changes I wanted to go through. I guess we sort of ran out of time, so I don't have a lot of time to go over all the syntax changes. Fortunately, the pipeline template has been updated so that the latest pipeline template has actually fixed most of these errors. But if you want to see things in more detail, you can go to the VS Code integration page in the Nextflow docs. You can see that here. And then if you go to syntax guide, I've tried to go through all of the changes that we've made. There aren't really changes so much as just restrictions. So there are certain things from the old Groovy syntax that are no longer supported. In almost every case, there is a workaround that already exists in what we would say like is the Nextflow specification. And I've tried to detail here, okay, if you encounter this error, here's how you can write it out a different way that the language server will accept. And if you're especially curious, you can go down here to the reference section. There's a page called syntax. And this is a more comprehensive just enumeration of all of the syntax that is allowed. So if you're curious about, hey, I'm using this particular thing in Groovy, is it still allowed or not? You can try to search for it here, or you can just plop it into the language server and see if the language server accepts it. And of course, this is a topic of ongoing discussion. So if you guys are using certain syntax and you feel like the language server is being too strict, you're more than welcome to make an issue or ping us on Slack and make the case for, hey, I think the syntax should be supported. And then we can talk to you about different ways that we'd like to address that, because we do want to make sure that the underlying use cases that you guys have are still supported, right? That's sort of our top priority. All right, I think I'll end it there and open the floor for questions, Phil.
Thanks very much, Ben. Just while you're still screen sharing, there's a couple of things I thought of, which would be nice to show you maybe, which also came up in questions. One thing with the docs, I'm not sure if you showed how you can hover over things like channel factory names and go directly to the docs from the tooltips. That's quite a nice feature.
I think I showed that with an operator.
Apologies if you did. Okay.
But we can also just pull something up real quick here. So like going back, here's the channel topic. And so, yeah, I can click read more.
That's what I mean. Sorry, I've been pretty busy answering questions, so apologies if I missed it. And one of the other questions was, especially for warnings which are about kind of future depreciations, which might be a way off, is there any way to kind of control in VS Code what warnings are shown?
Yes, I didn't get into this, but there is a setting called suppress future warnings. Um, these future warnings are turned off by default because if they're turned, we found that when they're turned on, there's just a lot of things that get highlighted and it's just too much noise. So I would say, you know, don't you just leave it like that if you don't if you're not bothered. If you want to like really get ahead of the curve, you can uncheck this and then you will see a lot more. Um, Let me just turn this off real quick. You'll start seeing a lot more warnings pop up, particularly around things like params and certain things that aren't supported anymore. But like I said, these future warnings are sort of like way off future, right? So they're not going to be a problem for you for a good while. And we're really not going to turn them into errors until we're confident that there is a smooth migration path for you, into some alternative syntax.
Nice. Thanks very much. Right, I might just quickly steal the screen share off you if that's all right.
Sure.
And then I'll just do a couple of wrap-up slides before we go into the Q&A. What's next then for everybody? Hopefully we've kind of convinced you that the new VS Code plugin is great. So I was looking at the poll results from the start. Apparently about nearly 90% of you are using VS Code, which is great. And just under 30% of you said that you have tried this new VS Code extension already. So 70% of you have got, that's your first task now, is to go off and go and install the new version of this extension and have a play and let us know what you think. I think there should be some links going into all these things about these things into the chat about now. In terms of feedback and questions, we have a new Sakira community forum, which is community.sakira.io. And there's a tag in there called VS Code. And that's where we're trying to centralize all of the discussion around the VS Code extension and language server updates. So if you have any problems, any questions, that's where to go. And Ben and I hang out there and keep a pretty close eye on that tag. So please drop a message there and we're happy to chat. In terms of other things going on, we've got the Nextflow podcast, and we had a dedicated episode about pretty much this topic where Ben and I chatted about it in a bit more of an interactive back and forth way and a slightly more technical sense a few weeks ago. So if this webinar wasn't enough and you want more, go and have a listen there. And also just a timely reminder that we have applications open right now for people to become for next year's batch of the Nextflow Ambassador program. So if you're a big fan of Nextflow, please check that out. Go and have a read about what's involved and what you get for it and what we want you to do. And please put in an application because it's a really fantastic program. With that, we've got a quick poll, I think, a bit of fun. Just quickly to put in, what are you going to do now? We're trying to think about what we want, what polls we should put in at the end. And instead, we decided to do this one instead. While you're reading that, I'm going to do a quick reminder that we have 2 Nextflow Summit events per year. The most recent one was Barcelona, just at the end of October. That's where we launched this new feature. So please go and check out summit.nextflow.io. All of the talks were live streamed to YouTube and all of them are still available on YouTube. So a lot of fantastic content there, both from Sakira speakers and all community talks, all on Nextflow. So really recommend having a look there and keep an eye on our events page as well for other things coming up. A nod to the podcast I mentioned where Ben and I spend quite a lot of time chatting, and we also get other guests on the show, available on Spotify and YouTube. Perfect to listen to on the car as you're driving home for Christmas. And that's also the best place, really, one of the best places to if you want to know about future upcoming syntax changes, which may be around the corner we haven't thought about yet. That's where we discuss this stuff. It's the real most technical outlet. So if you're an Nextflow expert, that's where to go and listen for the absolute latest. And then finally, if anyone is interested in hearing more from us about Sakira, there should be a new poll popping up now where you can let us know that you'd like to get in touch to hear more about Sakira platform or any other work that we do. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And in fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just in case anyone wants Ben to share a screen again, also just so you can see our faces. So Ben, I think the first question that came in which is what is that keystroke plugin?
All right, let me pull up my screen again. We were just talking about this right before, and it turns out that VS Code has it just built in. So if you do developer toggle screencast mode, then you just turn that on, and then now you should see the keystrokes. So
there you go. If you've got nothing else from today, there's a little tidbit for you. Great. I've got a few other questions here. I'm going to start off on a couple of really, really good technical ones from Kevin, who's put lots of questions in, and there was a couple that I thought were easier to discuss. One here about versioning. So is the LSP Nextflow version aware? So if a new Nextflow version is released with some syntax changes and we haven't updated our pipelines yet, will the LSP check against the AST for a specific version and preferably something that's configurable?
not yet, but for the reasons that you mentioned, it's something we would like to do. For now, the language server is basically tied to 2410. You can use it with earlier versions, but the farther back you go, like the worse the experience will get, of course. What we would like to do is basically add maybe an option in the VS Code extension so that you can just set your target Nextflow version, and then VS Code will just download the appropriate language server for that version. And so moving forward, we will try to have basically a language server release for every like Nextflow stable release. So there will be like a 2410, 25.4, 2510, so on and so forth. And you'll be able to just move between whichever one you want to use.
Great. There was another question from Kevin about how the language server can find modules. So how does the server know where the imported modules are? And if there are unimported modules, is there a way to configure the LSP to look for those and find them in the project?
Basically, it will just scan your entire, so like, I've got this, I've got Fetch and GS open here as like a folder. So this is like a workspace root in VS Code. It's going to treat this entire directory tree as like a single workspace, and it will just recursively search these directories, all the directories in there, for any Nextflow scripts. It's probably also worth mentioning that there is an option here to exclude certain folders. Because we found that, for example, it was scanning this .nf test folder and picking up like thousands of Nextflow scripts. And so you can add, excludes here if there's certain folders you don't want to pick. But yeah, modules are going to be picked up regardless of whether they're imported into the pipeline.
Apologies, Kevin. I answered you in text and I think I gave you the wrong answer. So it's better to take it from Ben instead because he actually knows this stuff. Great. A couple of questions from Robert Petit asking about deprecation. So are these new syntax changes coming to Nextflow going to be backwards compatible? And related but slightly different question, are there future plans to deprecate the published dir in favor of the new published, the new workflow output definition?
I think our general approach to deprecation is to introduce the new syntax as an optional thing. And then, maybe in the version after that, make it the default. And then you have to add an extra setting to enable the old behavior. And then maybe in the third version, taking it out entirely. So with things like published year, we really are, published year, it's really a matter of how long it takes for the community to really adopt the new syntax. There's sort of a give and take there, right? Like, I don't want to force people onto the new syntax if they don't feel comfortable using the new syntax. At the same time, if we never remove the old syntax, then some people will probably just never move off of it. So eventually, published year will probably be deprecated and removed, but that's not going to be until we feel super confident that the output syntax is the best way to do it.
Related, someone asked, is there going to be DSL3?
No, at least nominally, no. Obviously we're going to continue to evolve the language. I don't know what that's going to look like. If maybe we'll call it like Nextflow 24, Nextflow 25, or whatever, or maybe we'll just call it Nextflow. Ideally, if we can have sort of a smooth, experience of introducing new features and gradually moving out the old ones, then we don't really have to think about Nextflow DSL2 versus DSL3. But no, we certainly don't plan to make any changes on that level that, you know, the sort of the changes that DSL2 was against DSL1. I don't think we're ever going to do anything like that again. Our goal is to make any new changes sort of additive so that you can opt into them. And then eventually, like I said, eventually they become the default. And then maybe eventually they become the only option if it's too difficult to continue to support the old version. Backwards compatibility, again, it's also sort of a trade-off there. You know, we try to be as backwards compatible as we can without, you know, like clogging up the Nextflow code base, right? So there's give and take there.
We're up on time pretty much. I'm going to answer two more because I think they're good. But if we didn't get to your question, don't worry, we'll try and follow up with you or post it on the forum. There is one here. There's been a couple of questions about using these features, not just in VS Code, but also via the CLI. Any plans for formatting or testing via the CLI?
Right. So the language server is actually a separate project from the VS Code extension. You can see the GitHub repo here. It's just nextflow.io/language server. This is just a Java application, and it implements the language server protocol. So any editor that can understand the LSP can use this language server. And in fact, we've already had a few people adding support to other editors. I think this is the issue here. So people have already been adding it, I believe, to NeoVim and Emacs and a couple of other editors. So you can go and check out this link. Maybe Phil, you can include this one to see what other editors are supported. We're basically adding these to other editors as on a sort of an on-demand basis. So if there's an editor that you're interested in, you know, reach out. But this is the whole point of using language servers and the language server protocol is that we write the language server once, and then it's very easy to hook it into any editor that we want.
That wasn't the question I was really asking, but it was the one I was going to ask next. So you preempted me. But what I was trying to ask was actually about using command line, using these formatting and linting these tests in a terminal.
Oh, I see the other way around. Right. So the plan there is to basically move a lot of this functionality into the Nextflow CLI. So you'll probably see some new commands in the future, something like Nextflow check, Nextflow format, just some CLI commands that allow you to do exactly these things from the language server.
Yeah, and that also, there was another question there about kind of between Nextflow and the language server, one being more strict than the other. Like eventually these will become the same thing. The language server will be part of Nextflow. So there will be no separation between these two in the future.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay, we're 5 minutes over, so I'm going to wrap it up. Apologies, there are a lot of questions, great questions. I haven't had time to answer all of them, but we'll try and get back to you if they were not unanswered. And please drop into the community forum, post everything there. Let's keep the discussion going. All of this is open source. All of this is on GitHub. So create some issues, try and break it. Tell us how you break it, and we'll be great to kind of work this as a community project. And really happy to see so much enthusiasm. Cool. Thanks very much, everyone. See you next time.